Hi, I'm Billy Shore. Welcome back to Add Passion and Stir. It's our weekly conversation about food, about passion, and about making a difference in the world.
In most high schools, you noticeably feel like tension. You go into high schools and there's tension, and you can see it on the students. You can see it on the teachers. You can see it on the administration. It's like a tough environment.
People are like, what's the difference of a bar school? And I'm like, you can feel it. It's because people are smiling. High schools are so siloed. And so that's what so much of this work is just to get relationships back. If we pause and actually build relationships first, it will go much better.
I'm back in our DC studio with my sister, Debbie Shore. Welcome, Deb.
Yeah, good to be here.
Glad you're here.
Thanks.
And we've got a chef who knows about great food, and he knows about school food, and he's trying to make them one and the same. Dan Giusti, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And our other guest, Angie Jerabek, who has developed something called the BARR model, which is a form of educating kids that is, I think, in many ways as innovative and as potentially transformational as what Dan is doing in our nation's schools, and that's why we wanted to have the two of you on together. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
This should be a great conversation. I've really been looking forward to it because both of you have tried to do things that haven't been done before, and I would say Debbie and I have some experience with that in starting Share Our Strength. I think it's one of the hardest things you could possibly do, and at least along the way we've learned that everything is harder than it looked at first. Everything takes longer than we thought it was going to take. It's more expensive than we thought it was going to be. We've learned a lot. I think Calvin Trillin once said that every good idea eventually degenerates into hard work. And it's true, right? To make it happen, it's hard work. Dan, I want to start with you because your story is somewhat well known to people in the food world, and it's one of those kind of man bites dog stories. You did something that nobody thought a chef would do, which was leave the fine dining scene to devote yourself to a real purpose, a social purpose of really coming to the rescue of our nation's kids who need to eat better and need to be healthier and need to do better in school. And I know you've told this story before and you've been asked about it before, but the two things I know that our listeners will be interested in is, what was your path to cooking in the first place? Right. And then what was that moment? And Debbie and I talked about this earlier. We both had the same question. What was that moment where you said, I'm going to take a different road at this fork in the road? But I know that you started cooking here in Washington, D.C. You were at Clyde's in 1789.
Yeah.
Tell us where it started.
Yeah, so basically where it started is why ultimately I got back to doing what I'm doing now. And, I come from a big Italian family, and cooking was important in my family. I have one aunt in particular where we like to go to her house because she's the best cook. And that's why I feel like we always felt we wanted to go to her house, is because the food was the best. I feel like every family has that one family member that if it's a holiday, you want to go there. And alternatively, there's like people in your family you don't want to go to their house because they don't cook very well. But then I came to realize, like, I'm a big eater. I eat everything. And I have brothers and sisters and also nieces and nephews who don't eat everything. And they really like going there too. So I realized it's not so much about the fact that the food is so good. It's that she's really great at hosting people and making you feel comfortable, and you really wanted to just be there. And subconsciously growing up, like, she was like the favorite in our family, and I just loved that. And I started to cook. I started to become interested in cooking. When I got to high school,
Did she teach you to cook, your aunt, or it was just the influence?
No,
or the
I mean
inspiration?
she essentially is the kind of person that even now when I go there and I'm like, I want to do something, God forbid I touch anything, I have to sit there and she has to cook for me. But initially it was just this idea that she influenced me to just think about cooking as a career. It had nothing to do with fancy restaurants or big time chefs. It was just the idea of cooking for people. So when I went to high school, everybody's talking about college. I said, I want to be a chef. And that's where it started. I got a job at Clyde's of Georgetown, started working, loved working in a restaurant. I loved the idea of hearing that people were happy about the food. And that's all it was for me. Then I went to culinary school right after high school. And then quickly it was about fine dining.
So it's Culinary Institute of America at Hyde Park?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And all it was about was, where can you go? You need to go to the top. You need to work in fine dining. You need to work in New York City. You need to work here. And really from that point on, until I got to Noma, that's all it was about. It was literally, it's like the whole mentality behind cooking for me changed. It was cooking for myself. It was the idea of, I wanted to rise to the top. I wanted to cook the food that I wanted to cook. And again, it got me to Noma. I became the head chef at Noma.
And describe what Noma is. Some of us in the culinary community know, but not everybody.
Sure. So Noma is a restaurant in Copenhagen that there is a list out there, as strange as it may sound, particularly because it's administered by a water company, San Pellegrino, but it rates the top restaurants in the world, the top 50. And during the time that I was there, it was the top restaurant in the world for 4 years.
It became a destination restaurant. People all over the world made a trip just to Copenhagen to eat at Noma.
It essentially...
Wait, it became number one when you were there cooking?
Or? It was number one before I was there. And then
it didn't slip while you were there?
It did. And then we got it back, though. So you can look at that in a couple ways. There was a lot of pressure, but it made Copenhagen like a destination city, actually. Like if you go to Copenhagen now, there's all kinds of restaurants there. But anyway, it's a very avant-garde place where the majority of food is foraged. And quite frankly, it's pretty much dictated what's happening in a lot of restaurants around the world for the past decade. So I went there, became the head chef, and it really gave me the confidence to kind of look at what I'm doing, why I was doing it, and when it was time to move on, it wasn't because I was burnt out. I really still liked the idea of working in a restaurant. It had nothing to do with not liking the restaurant. It was just a tremendous amount of pressure working there, and it was time to move on. But I had the confidence to just say, you know what, like I didn't get into cooking to do this in the first place. It had nothing to do with fine dining. This isn't what I'm most passionate about. I knew I wanted to cook for more people. In a place like Noma, we were 45 to 50 chefs cooking for 45 people at a time.
Rarefied atmosphere.
Right. And you're cooking for people who obviously have the means to do whatever they want. Beyond that, though, in a restaurant, the one thing you don't get to do is cook for people very often, particularly in a restaurant like Noma, where you're cooking for people once in a lifetime. So I knew I wanted to cook for a lot of people. And maybe more importantly, I wanted to cook for them all the time. In a way that you could really change the way they're living their lives, in the way they're eating, in the way they're thinking about food. So that's really kind of where the thinking started to how do I do that? What's the way to do this? And I think you could think of a variety of ways to do it, but essentially I came to the idea of institutional food really checks off all those boxes, whether it's in a public school, whether it's in a hospital, whether it's in a prison, whether it's in a senior care center. You're cooking for people that have to be there. These are typically people that really need good food. They're in a stage of their life where they're in a position that they need nutrition. This food has been neglected, and you're cooking for these people all the time. So this kind of was the starting point of this. And schools in particular, for me, it's close to my heart. The idea of being around young people and getting them early and getting them to think differently about food and kind of influencing them to have better eating habits. And then also generally just being a positive role model. In the schools that we're in, you see a lot of kids that they're really in positions that it's quite challenging. And to be around and to kind of influence them in a positive way through food is a really exciting thing. So that's kind of how the whole idea started.
And so you had this instinct you wanted to cook for a lot of people and make a difference. And then you kind of developed the idea. It wasn't just school meals need to be better and I'm going to go fix those. You found it. You looked for it. You searched for it.
Yeah, I searched for it. And I think the idea was that, the thing that sealed it for me was I was trying to think of how I could cook for a lot of people, and I did want to do it at scale. The idea of, say, creating a fast casual or fast food restaurant to serve low-cost meals to people that were wholesome, it seemed slightly irresponsible, again, because there's so much food waste. The idea of cooking a lot more food. So the idea of going into a place where food was already being made, but it wasn't necessarily receiving the attention that it should receive, like many other spaces do, seemed like the responsible way to do that. Beyond that, all the kitchen spaces in these institutions typically have been neglected just the same. They're not organized like a regular professional kitchen. No thought has been put into them. And the staff that's working in these institutional kitchens haven't been trained properly. So it just seemed, again, like the way to do it. Like go in, there's a lot of people out there already making food. Work with those people, train them, organize the kitchen spaces, and make that food better that's already being prepared.
And I've heard you say on a CBS Sunday Morning interview about the kids that they don't have any choices, right? They just get what they get.
Yeah.
And so you've got to make it good, and you really felt that.
It's a captive audience, and it's this idea that as an adult, you have all the information in front of you on the internet now. You can make a choice as to where you want to go. If you go eat somewhere and it's not good, well, you made a choice. You could have really researched it. these kids have absolutely no choice. They're there every day. Obviously, we can try to offer as much variety as we can, but that's even quite difficult within the constraints that we face. But they have to show up every single day. And it's almost that the issue is not even that they're kids. People are like, well, kids are picky. If you took 600 adults and put them in the same place every single day and only offered them 2 to 3 things that they couldn't make really many decisions on, they couldn't customize it, a good percentage of them would probably become disgruntled at some point. So it is just a challenge in that sense.
Yeah. Angie, you had a set of insights also about serving people, and particularly serving young people in schools and doing things differently than they've been done before. Tell us a little bit about where that started for you and how it led to BARR.
Sure. So the background's a little bit interesting. So because you went back to high school, I will too. So in college, I had a real hard time picking a major. Ended up being a music performance major.
Where were you in school?
St. Ben's up in Minnesota, and got a teaching degree. Turns out, didn't love the teaching, but really liked working with kids individually. So I got my counseling license. So got my first job at a first-ring suburb right outside of Minneapolis, and was working there, and half the 9th graders were failing every year. So I had 5 years running where 50% of the kids are failing a class.
And where was this? What school?
St. Louis Park, Minnesota.
Half the kids were failing.
Half the kids are failing.
Wow.
So I went to the administrator, I'm not feeling successful, as you can imagine, and said, I need to resign. Like, these kids need to pass their classes in 9th grade to be able to graduate in time. And he said, well, this isn't our school, and this isn't you. This is the national average. About 40 to 50% of 9th graders fail a class, which is still the case.
But nobody else in the school is kind of, raising the flag. I mean,
Right, right.
How could you be the first one?
Absolutely, because people typically don't look at 9th grade failure rates. You only look at graduation, and depending on how the state kind of collects that data, the graduation rate may or may not have included 9th grade. So I'm in charge of 9th graders. I'm like, half of them are failing a class. And a lot of the kids who are failing are kids who you wouldn't necessarily think that they're going to fail. So like I'd call you in and say, Dan, you're failing physical education. He's like, Miss Jerabek, everyone's failing. No big deal. So there's this pure norming.
That was the culture.
Yes. Yeah. And so there was no kind of stigma attached with failing. And then by the time they figured out that, failing that class in 9th grade now has put some pretty big roadblocks in as I'm trying to graduate in time or look at colleges. So the principal's like, this is not us. This is not you. You should come up with something different. So I will go back to the fact that I'm a pretty creative person. So I'm like, the school's not working the right way. To your point, I'm like, I've got a ton of passionate adults. I got talented kids, and I got a lot of adults stuck in silos. And I'm the school counselor, have this access to information no one else has. Because I know that, Debbie, you're really talented at art, but you're not doing anything in math. But the math teacher thinks you're lazy. And I know you're not lazy. It's just that you haven't connected with the math teacher. So kind of spent the summer and came up with this new model of doing school. Came to the principal and said, I got a new way to do things. Had a fantastic administrator who said, okay, as long as you come up with a grant to try it, give it a run. And so within the first year, we cut our failure rates in half. And so it's now been in place for 20 years.
Describe the model. What are the ingredients of the model?
There's 2 pillars. One is...
Why is it called BARR, first of all?
Building assets, reducing risks. 2 pillars. And they're so obvious. One is you need to build relationships. You got to have relationships from staff to student, student to student, and staff to staff. And you really need healthy relationships staff to staff if you're going to address really hard topics, which typically schools don't have. You're typically in a department, and a math teacher is not going to talk to an English teacher, especially about a student. So you got to pull those silos apart. The next one is data. You need to open up that data system. So that math teacher needs to know that student is doing well in English. They need to know what their passions are. And everyone's got to be attentive to qualitative data. People in schools see so many things, and you're not trained to look for it and share it. So I have a kind of quick illustration of the qualitative data, and this is a powerful example, but it happens all across the country. So we had a school that was doing this model right away, had 3 teachers meeting together. They're like, I don't know that we really need to do this, but one teacher says, I've got 2 girls skipping my class every Friday and Monday, 14-year-old girls, 9th graders. So there's someone there that's taking the information within the school. And the next teacher says, you know what? I was walking through the lunchroom. They're not sitting at the 9th grade table. They're hanging with a bunch of older boys. Someone should give them a quiet lunch. Next teacher says, they're not making dress code. Someone should call them in, give them a dress code violation. So the person who was there getting the information says, I'll come back. Basically been given a directive to give consequences to the kids. They come back, and it turns out they're all being sex trafficked. And they're being shipped out Thursday night. They're being shipped back Monday night. So none of these
That's
things.
pretty intense.
Yes.
And it can't be an isolated case.
Not. There was a full orchestration. Police ended up being involved. But the reality is all of those observations for an individual would not have been that powerful until we put them together. So both in terms of the number of absolute horrible situations students are in, that these are caring adults that want to help, but you've got to be able to break up those silos and share that information, as well as powerful things.
I'm just curious. Wow, there's just a lot there to unpack. But
Yep.
I'm curious about the kind of the demographic of the school. When you got there, and when you talked about the relationships that you're building, staff to student to. I noticed you didn't say anything about the parents. I don't think. I feel like you would have to have some family connection in order to make that happen.
Yep. So we have 2 pillars, but there's 8 components. One of the components is family engagement. And so it absolutely is critical that you're engaging the community, you're engaging the families, and that's kind of a key piece. But when we're kind of talking these guiding principles, we're like data relationships. But then there are things that have to happen. In terms of the school, it was about 80% free and reduced lunch, high mobility. But I think we're in 140 schools now. So I think another...
How many cities or states?
16 states in D.C. And we're in 98 districts. So the other piece is the research. So we're the only model to get all 3 of the Invest in Innovation research grants. So we've been doing within school randomized control trials. So we train adults, but we measure the impact on kids. So half the kids are assigned to adults that are trained in the model, half the kids have school as usual. So that way, if the school wins the basketball championship, you can't say, well, that was something unique. And at the end of the year, when you're training the adults this way, the students have higher standardized test scores. They have higher GPAs, lower failure rates, and they're happier. So the students are happier and the staff's happier.
I was so struck by, those data points you just did, the higher GPA, probably higher attendance, I'm guessing, fewer disciplinary problems, which are exactly the things that we see, right, with the No Canary campaign. When kids are getting breakfast, all those things are happening as well.
Just to go back for a minute to the sex trafficking, is that a thing in our schools?
Absolutely.
Like how many kids were involved at this school?
Well, so at this school, there ended up being about a dozen, but it was identified in week 2, and there were 2 14-year-old girls who, once again, would have all been identified as breaking rules.
Parents didn't know?
They were in foster care.
Yeah. They were in foster care. All of them were in foster care.
So, but it continues to go back to, I think, the point that you were making. There's talented adults, caring adults that are in this place, and how do we re-equip them to be able to serve better? And I think that's the piece that I think that we're finding. There's such capacity, and they're there, and they want to do, this work, and we need to give them another way of doing it.
I think that's right. I think there's a lot of organizations out there who are going into schools to almost do something on their own when there's already a lot of great people working in schools, and it's just a matter of how much investment has been put into those individuals to train them and give them the tools to do things. And that's a big piece. And there's a lot of folks out there working in schools. It's a tough job, and they're the ones who are always asked to follow through with every initiative. They're asked to do a variety of things, and how much time is invested in them to give them those tools. And I think that's a huge problem.
Dan, Angie was talking about the importance of relationships, and I've heard you talk about kids need to see who's cooking their food, right? Like you come out there, you want them to know that there's a person and there's a face behind it, and that there's the meaning that gives it.
I think it's more important than the food itself. Honestly, I think you're kidding yourself if you're a chef and you think food is more important than anything else. The personal interaction, whether it's in a restaurant, whether it's in a school, is always going to be more important. I always think that's what it is. Like, you could serve the best food in a school that's ever been served tomorrow. It doesn't mean anything. If the kids aren't, identifying that this food was cooked by someone that they understand, they know, they've met, they feel comfortable with, it might not mean anything to them. So we spend a lot of time to try to just make the kids feel comfortable. You're not going to have kids want to try new things just randomly. Some might. Some are adventurous. Some might say, I want to try something. Or they might be in a household where that is common practice. They're trying new foods and things like that.
So in the schools, you're working with the lunch ladies?
Right.
Okay. Could be, and what you just said about relationships, we know that the lunch ladies have such a presence in the school. So, as the relationships either transition from them to you or together,
Well, what it is so we put chefs into schools. We work with the staff that was previously there. to essentially train them and give them the tools to do this. Now, unfortunately, you can have the cafeteria staff be super hardworking, doing their job day in, day out, and have been doing it for a very long time. But stereotypically, and it is the truth, they are quite often very much not respected, unfortunately. Don't get me wrong, there are schools where the kids really do relate with the cafeteria staff. They talk to them, they say thank you. But in your average school kitchen, your average school cafeteria, if you go there and you just watch lunch, particularly at the higher grades in high school, it's very rare that you hear a student say thank you or say hello or smile. And obviously this wears on the cafeteria staff. And then this relationship really starts to deteriorate. So one place we've had success with, well, I should backtrack and say too, if you're on the cafeteria staff, a lot of which of these people cook at home and they take pride in cooking. They cook for their families, they cook for themselves. They're good cooks. But within their cafeteria, they're making food that they don't like, they don't think is good. They know the kids don't like it. And if you can imagine, if you're someone who cooks and is passionate about cooking and proud that you know how to cook, the fact that you are literally serving kids food that you know is not good, that they don't enjoy, it really creates strain on this whole situation. So going into the schools, training the staff, giving them the confidence, also, improving the quality of the food so they feel good about it, they're proud about it. It really starts to change the relationship.
So are you? I'm just going to say, are you changing the? You're procuring different food, or you're working with the food that's there? A little bit of both.
Yeah, a little bit of both. I think the thing that a lot of folks don't understand is that the National School Lunch Program really does make it very challenging to make changes. So there's a lot of procurement rules. So essentially what happens is, I think it's important to put into context. If you're a public school and you participate in the National School Lunch Program, which most do because that's where the federal reimbursement comes in, essentially you serve a meal. When you serve that meal, it has to meet very strict nutritional guidelines dictated by the USDA, and then you get a certain amount of money back. This year for lunch in particular is $3.41. Because you're getting money from the federal government, there are a lot of strings attached to that money. So if you bring in a service like a consultancy like ours, essentially, or you bring in a new product, a type of vegetable, everything has to go through processes. So it's not easy, even if you live in a place that's surrounded by farms, to just say, wow, that produce is great, the price is right, I'm going to go get it. It doesn't work that way. So it really is challenging. And if you can imagine, this is one of the things, obviously, we talk about chefs and their ability to cook and train staff. But if you're a food service director and do not have a lot of experience in food procurement, the idea of working with the local farmer and finding a way to make that happen could really be challenging. So you never end up doing that. So that's something we've been able to start to help food service programs do as well.
So I want to backtrack
Sure.
even a little bit more with both of you, because we've heard the idea and the insights that you both had. I want to hear how you got started. So like, what was the first school? How'd you do it? You've created an organization
Sure.
called Brigaid.
Right.
Tell us, what did it take to get this going?
Yes.
And then I want to hear the same thing with, the way you've, Angie, scaled your program.
Sure. I mean, the initial idea was I started a company. It's important to say it is a for-profit company, and that was very intentional to do that because I didn't necessarily know how to get into school food. And I didn't see a model that was in line with the way I was thinking. So I started the company because I was at NOMA. A few weeks before I left, the Washington Post wrote a profile about me. A lot of people from around the United States wrote to me, food service directors, superintendents, parents. I mean, I spent basically 2 months driving around the United States, meeting with anyone who had contacted me. I was having lunch with parents in their houses, talking to anyone about school food. One of the people that reached out to me was the superintendent of New London Public Schools. Again, I had actually originally come to D.C. I was thinking like big cities, obviously D.C. This was still under the Obama administration, so there was a great interest in improving school food. But this gentleman who was the superintendent of New London Public Schools in Connecticut, it's a town, a very small town of 25,000 people, equidistant between Boston and New York. A town where it really represents the idea that Connecticut is the state with the largest disparity between poverty and wealth. 1 in 4 people in New London is under the poverty line, surrounded by very affluent little towns. So I went there. I met with the superintendent. He had me stay there for a week, which was interesting because, again, it was this like tiny little town. Met with the mayor, met with every school principal, met with kids. Just a guy who really got it. He knew what this would take. I love the town. It seemed like a town that could use something like this and that would appreciate something like this. So I literally just said, okay, let's try to do it here. I moved to New London, and we had to go through the process. I had to present to the Board of Education in a small meeting that you see kind of on public access television, where it's very official and it's televised and no one's watching it and all these things. And I was super nervous, and they approved it. And it just started there. I literally worked with New London Public Schools and this superintendent to really and just listen to them. I knew I wanted to put chefs in schools, but I didn't really know the best way to do it and the best way to have the right relationship so this would be received well. So I worked with them to understand what the best relationship would be, and that's where we started. And we literally just started to hire chefs. And those chefs worked for New London Public Schools, and we just started to put chefs in schools. And in a very simple way, those chefs just started to take food that was primarily heat and serve and start to transition that food into scratch cooking. And that's where this model makes a lot of sense. It's not really complicated. It's taking chefs who are trained to essentially do this work and put them in the environment to do it. The most complicated piece is finding the right chefs to do this work.
I'm sure you know Bill Telepan from Wellington Schools, and they do something similar.
Sure.
Are there differences there?
Yeah, I think, so Bill Telepan works for Wellness in the Schools, primarily based in New York City, but now expanding outside of New York City. So we do work with them. We have a good relationship with them. Their model is training in kitchens. It's also physical education. It's also food education, food and nutrition education. So what we kind of the approach that we take, and it's a big topic. Honestly, a lot of people will ask us, do you do education in the classrooms? Do you do tasting? Do you do this?
They're staying focused.
We take a very practical approach. I mean, when the conversation happens, it's exciting to talk about school gardens. It's exciting to talk about food education. It's exciting to talk about these things. It's not maybe so sexy to talk about training and practicality regarding going into a kitchen and organizing it, getting the staff, getting standards and procedures implemented. These are all kind of behind the scenes things. Like at Anoma, nobody talks about the fact that the standards and procedures that were in place at a restaurant like that were so high, because no one wants to talk about that. You talk about the food. Everybody wants to talk about the menu, the food. But before you get there, you really have to get these kitchens organized, and you have to make sure they're equipped properly. So we do a lot of that as well. So we basically took a model that was looking at a variety of things. And when we first started, we're going to approach many different topics and really whittled it down to focusing on operations in a school kitchen.
In a town like New London or anywhere you've been, what kind of pushback do you get when a chef with your credentials comes in and says, I'm going to change the food system?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought that, I will say, coming from Noma, if I chose to open a restaurant, it would have been great. It would have really helped me out. Getting into this work, it always makes people a bit, or I should say very skeptical as to why I'm doing this and why I've ended up, for example, in New London. So when it came to presenting this idea at the Board of Education meeting, there were 7 board members, one of which during the meeting actually asked me how much money I've made during my career. He was very concerned, and he thought it was very strange that I was in New London, Connecticut, a place I had no connection to, and that I had come from this big fancy restaurant. Why am I in this town? Am I just here to become rich off of this small school district? That was a question. The day after that meeting, in the New London Day online, this tiny little publication, there was like 95 comments, if you can imagine, on this little publication, one of which will always stand out in my mind. I always remember it, is why don't we just send kids to school in limousines?
Because we're going to feed them well.
It was this idea that the idea of putting a chef of this caliber, if you will, in a school was the most like extraneous luxury that should never happen. And those are, that was littered among other comments that said like, I ate terrible school food as a kid and I turned out all right. Even though this is a guy making a comment on the New London Day website at 3:30 in the morning. It's like, I don't know how you turned out, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, it was like, there was definitely a lot of skepticism. Yeah.
It's good. You're not easily discouraged. This is a good thing.
Oh, I'm not. In fact, it motivates me even more because you know what? It doesn't stop. Everywhere we go, every school we go in every district we go into, there's a lot of skepticism as to why we're there. And I would even say, and this is a frustrating thing, a lot of people in the space who do this work and who've done this work for a long time look at me as someone who is coming in from a different place, because we've received a decent amount of press because of my background at Noma, it's like we don't belong, like we've done something wrong. It's really tough. Like it's hard to explain for me, but they feel as though we're working within different rules and different parameters, and it's easier for me to do things because of my background. It's like, so, that will just have to be the way it is for some time, and we'll keep going, and people will realize that we're the real deal.
Angie, you talked about having initially at your school a very enlightened administrator who embraced and gave you this charge to go out and do this. But then how did you take it to the next step? What kind of challenges did you face in terms of getting this into other communities?
Right. So about 10 years, we did this for about a decade at the school I was at. And I kept thinking, this is so obvious. Every school should be working like this, that we should be opening up this communication. We should be, making sure that we are making sure that everyone has data and kind of accessing to the relationships that are necessary. That being said, it wasn't happening. So needless to say, the Obama administration had a competition, an I3 competition. And I thought...
I3 meaning?
Investing in innovation.
Okay.
Basically, they're like looking for things that are working in schools, and could this be replicated in other settings, and could it withstand kind of a high level of research? So I thought, well, this should be obvious. So I wrote this, in my, it was a custodian's closet, was my office, and thought, well, I should, have this work. And I am in Midwest suburbs, and I should work in an urban setting in the West Coast and rural in the East Coast. Should work in all settings. It shouldn't matter kind of what the schools are like, and this should work these different places. So big competition, and our application was ranked number 2. So big winner. I'm going to be honest, I don't know anybody outside of Minnesota. So I'm now on listservs trying to can I find some schools that would maybe want to try this new model that I've made up, and by the way, work with the federal government and do a big research study. Super fortunate when I did. Found a school in Bucksport, Maine, as well as rural Maine, and Hemet, California, so right in Riverside, California. And the school in Riverside, California also agreed to do a within-school randomized control trial. So that's a pretty kind of heavy ask to say, can you both do this model, and I want to do a big research study. So the other piece was we were going to do a relationship intervention, and typically if you're going to improve academics, you double dose. So if you're not good at math, you're going to take 2 math classes. If you're not doing well at something, we're going to give you a curriculum, a technology. And I'm saying we double in on relationships. So we're going to have relationships be the key, and kids will do better. So in particular at the secondary level, you don't move standardized test scores by building relationships, in particular with the current staff. I'm saying the staff that's there knows the kids. They know the community. We're not going to replace the staff. We just have to give them a different way of operating. So at the end of that first year, everyone did better. And so then I got the next grant. I'm like, let's apply for another grant. So we're going to do 11 more within-school randomized control trials.
But you're not adding staff to surround these kids. You're changing their jobs.
It's professional development and coaching. So we go into whatever school, and we're going to give them training and coaching to do this model different. We're on all the approved lists, the evidence for ESSA. So we're an approved list for reading. We're an approved list for math. We're an approved list also for social emotional. We're also an approved list for risk reduction. So we're on many approved lists so schools can access federal funds to bring the training and coaching in.
Oh, wow.
So
that's big time.
So, but the growth has all been based on the study. So subsequently, superintendents would tell another superintendent, they're like, why are your kids doing better? Because I think the other really important piece I want to reference is as much as everyone's doing better, the gaps are closing. Black, Latinx, and low-income students are exponentially doing better. So this level of attentiveness, when you're looking at data and you're looking at relationships and you're looking at strengths, those gaps are closing. So those students are both not failing at the same rate, but they're in more AP classes, they're graduating at a higher rate. So there's really big commitment to equity because you have adults in the building that want to be able to connect with these students and have them do well. And that's what this model is able to do. So you can have everyone do better. So it's not just for students that are struggling, but in addition to everyone doing better, you're getting to those students that need that attentiveness.
Angie, in terms of the ideas and the insights that you brought forth, what type of skepticism and resistance have you received or experienced, and what have you done to overcome it?
So that's a notable barrier. So even though people aren't pleased with the system, it's a system they know, so they like to hang on to it. So that is a challenge. So I'll be honest, I initially thought there'd be a groundswell of teachers that would just kind of push this up, and schools are so hierarchical. Typically, it's been a top-down mandate, and oftentimes it's been a mandate because the school is in a position that they either have to fire all their teachers or do something different, and this is another thing they could do instead. So they're like, okay, I'll take the training on relationships and data before I'll have half my friends be fired. The reality is after they do it, they love it. So we are just having this groundswell of the expansion is other teachers telling other teachers, or when you go to a new school, you're like, guys, we have to do school this way. So the experience is what the motivation has been. But in terms of getting in, it has been, you're forced to do this.
Dan, tell us a little bit about, in addition to what you do in the kitchen and what you've done with the food, what you do in the front of the house to just make the entire experience better for kids.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of things that need to be improved in most cases when you're talking about the entire eating and cafeteria experience. Quite often, cafeteria spaces are not the nicest spaces. So there's a lot to be desired in terms of what can be improved there. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not. Quite often, cafeterias are in the basement or in a location of the school where there are no windows. That's obviously not a great start. So that can be easy in some places and more difficult in other places. But one place where I feel like we have direct ability to make impact is obviously by putting these chefs into schools and working with the staff. This is, again, a relationship thing. So our ability to follow up with students one-on-one is the most important thing. I think we've found that just handing surveys out, again, soliciting information that way is not great. And that's typically when we receive comments like try harder or what can we do better, everything. You know, kids think it's funny to just like write these kind of comments. When you go into the cafeteria and you sit down with a group of students very casually, and what we found is like instead of it being very robotic, because when we first started, we'd sit down with the students and be like, how's lunch today? Then the next day, how's lunch today? Then the next day, how's lunch today? Do you like vegetables? It becomes super robotic. So instead, just talk to them. We just talked, oh, how was your weekend? How's football going? How's this going? And then, surely enough, because you're the chef or you're the person running the kitchen, they will then come to you when the time comes to tell you either that they like the food or that they don't like the food and why, and actually will take time to articulate as to why. It's not just gross anymore. It's, you know, I had the chicken today and it was actually kind of hard to eat with, you know, this way. So we just find like the idea of getting into the cafeteria, and it's challenging. You have a lunch wave of 300 kids and they have 18 minutes to eat, you know, between serving them properly and efficiently and then finding time to get in the cafeteria, but you have to do it. You have to be present, just like in a restaurant. You know, we don't have waiters or managers, if you will, to do that. You're kind of a one team has to do everything, but being present in the cafeteria while students are eating, I think is the best way to get information, also to create relationships, and probably the one way in which we have the ability to make impact in terms of the front of the house, if you will.
And I guess like the ninth graders who have nothing to compare it to, right? You don't know what you don't know. You couldn't have probably envisioned some of these challenges before you got into it.
Sure, yeah.
Right?
Some of the challenges, you know, the challenges that are in regards to the food, yeah, as a chef, you know what you're going to face. You know, okay, the budget's very low.
But the bureaucracy of New York City's Department of Education.
Well, I will say that there's bureaucracy that you deal with, and it's not even that you don't expect it. It's that literally you can't even get answers about some of these things. There's things that happen, processes, the way contracts are given or not given, or how communication happens, and you can literally ask 20 people to explain it to you, how it works, so you know moving forward. And it's actually difficult to even get that real information. So it is a little frustrating, and it's a lot of unexpected things. And, you know, so you see a lot of things too, and every stage is different. You know, Angie's talking about the high schools particularly, and we talk about ninth grade, like this relationship situation. I mean, if you go to an elementary school, your average elementary school, and then you go into high school across the street, in most high schools, you noticeably feel like tension. You go into high schools and there's tension, and you can see it on the students. You can see it on the teachers. You can see it on the administration. It's like a tough environment. Every high school you go into, you feel it. So it's like a very different situation dealing with a cafeteria staff in a high school versus in an elementary school. You know, people are a little more like lighthearted, happy-go-lucky. In a high school, it's like you think and I hate to say it, but in a lot of in the way high schools are treated, it's like you're in a prison. It's like discipline. It's like we have to rein everyone in. We have to make lunchtime shorter because kids are going to be out of order, and we don't trust kids, and we're not going to talk to kids and get friendly with kids. It's crazy.
Angie, does that align with your experience?
Actually, it's interesting you say that because I say, people are like, what's the difference of a bar school? And I'm like, you can feel it.
I'm sure you can.
I mean, you walk in the school and you can feel it in
immediately.
5 minutes because people are smiling, and in particular, I mean, because high schools are so siloed. I mean, those departments, like a math department stays in the math department. You eat with the math department, you don't talk. And if you do talk, it's about curriculum. It's not about, even, do you have kids as a fellow colleague? And so that's what so much of this work is just to get relationships back. It's fascinating. You have thousands of people there, but people aren't talking about relationships, or that relationships are secondary. Like after we do, grind it out, get them, the content down, where it's like, if we pause and actually build relationships first, it will go much better, in terms of all the adults working together as well as the kids working together and how we interact. But that feeling piece, I totally get. You walk in and you can, the posturing and kind of,
anyone can feel it. I would even say before 5 minutes. Like the minute you walk, because usually someone has to let you in
yes.
to a school. Usually they
yes.
should. And you go into a school and it's like immediate. And even, for example, in New York City, they have resource officers at the front, there's police officers at every single school. Even them, they're the same group of people technically, but depending on what school they're in, you can tell that there's just more of a community feel. I feel like in a lot of schools, unfortunately, literally it's students have to show up. They have to come to school to learn. And as a teacher or a staff member, you have to show up to teach kids or provide another service. There's nothing else to it. It's not like we're spending 8 hours a day here. Let's develop relationships. Let's be comfortable. It's like, it's just mandatory and you just feel it. And it's really like off-putting, to be honest with you.
Dan, do you ever miss it? Noma 1789, that rarefied atmosphere that we talked about?
Being at Noma was like really cool. It's a very special restaurant. And I always loved like the intensity of it. But I will say...
Do you still have influence there? If we want to go?
Yes.
Okay. Just checking.
Oh.
I do.
That's the only question she's really been interested in.
I'll
It's been in my head for about an hour.
But the idea that
I had the same question.
I try to get younger people who are getting in this career to really think about it. There's a lot of ways you can cook professionally. And again, you are very much kind of funneled into cooking and fine dining. So the only job I've ever had in my whole life has been cooking. But I've never been happier with what I do now. This is how I want to do it. But it took me a long time to get there. And I'm always trying to visit a lot of culinary schools and say, look, don't think you need to cook in a restaurant. There's a lot of ways you can cook, a lot of different ways to do it. So yeah, I as much as I could say I kind of miss it sometimes, not really. I would say genuinely I'm more happy than I've ever been. Yeah.
And do you see other young chefs kind of gravitating towards this, or do they have to go through what you went through first to know?
No, I think it's a little bit of both. We've seen some young chefs join us early on, and they have their days where they're making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And I think if it's a bad day and they have some kids that aren't happy, they're thinking to themselves, should I be doing this or should I be working in so-and-so fine dining restaurant? You definitely need to be confident in yourself and not worry about what other people are going to think. Do you know how to cook? Do you not know how to cook? I can say that. No one questions my ability as a chef because of my background. You can't have an ego and you have to be confident. So if you can do that at a young age out of culinary school, then it's perfect. I feel like a lot of young chefs do need to get something out of their system. They need to go and prove them to themselves that I can cook. I know I can cook, so I don't need to have an ego. I don't need to prove to this 6-year-old kid that I need to, that I can cook. I can put a lot of effort into making something very simple and get gratification in that. So I think it depends on the person, but I would like to think that moving forward, a lot of young people will really consider the variety of ways that they can cook, particularly now because they are suited to help alleviate a lot of problems around the world. There's a lot of things that involve food, and I think there's a lot of young chefs who could get involved in an operational way. I always tell a lot of young chefs there's a lot of great ideas out there, a lot of smart people coming up with great ideas in terms of how they can help people through food. but a lot of them don't have the operational sense to make that happen. And these young people coming out of culinary school are the right people to go and work with these organizations, whether for-profit companies, nonprofit companies, and really help them bring these ideas to fruition. And I think obviously with people like Jose Andres, and you're seeing this idea that there are a lot of other ways to cook and to help. And I would definitely predict that younger chefs are going to start to get involved.
Well, we unfortunately have to bring this conversation to a close because we've been talking for almost an hour. Just the last thing I guess I'd like to ask is, since you're both kind of taking on these formidable odds, it's almost like a David and Goliath, dynamic with the big school systems. What do you each do to keep yourself charged?
So I love good food. So that's just no, friends and family, and I think that's kind of a key piece. And I think the other piece is going back to one of the things I have always asking for is stories from the schools. So I have, lots of schools that are sending me stories of individual student impacts. Try Harder, I'm going to think of often because that comes up a lot. But I think actually having it be personalized and having it not just be numbers, but be like, okay, this actually made a difference for this student. And, very recently there was a student who was a really gifted soccer player and had some eligibility issues based on grades, and these teachers came behind, and then he ended up, winning this, kind of big game and having this big
sure
hero.
He was able to play.
Yes, and kind of the things that have happened, but those types of things you think at night, where you're like that family celebrating that, the kids in the paper, and if it wouldn't have had that team together, he went to been on the field and kind of where his life's at. It feels really good.
Yep. And Angie, the best way for people to learn more about the BARR strategy and system and organization is a website?
Yes, www.barrcenter.org.
barrcenter.org.
Mm-hmm. BARR.
Yep. Excellent. How about you in terms of staying as highly charged? I can't imagine you slowing down, Dan. But
yeah, I think it's the idea that when you work, you have to recalibrate how you judge success. If you work in a restaurant or fine dining restaurant or a place like Noma, if people literally didn't say it was the best meal they ever had in their life, let alone didn't like it was a problem.
You were crushed.
So in schools, it's almost the opposite. And I think if you're not present, and for example, last year I was spending a lot of time doing a variety of things, trying to keep the business going, move forward, visit other districts, meetings in New York City. You're not in the schools as often, and all you hear about is the issues, the problems, and it does beat you down. All it takes, if you go to a school and you're in a school and you see a couple positive things happening that otherwise wouldn't be happening, or a kid eating the food who otherwise wouldn't be eating that food, that's all it takes for you to be like, this is it. This is worth it. So you just have to recalibrate, I think, the way you judge success. And for me, the more present I am in the schools, and this year I'm trying to be in a school basically every day, you can glean enough from that to keep you super excited about moving forward.
I want to thank you so much, Dan Giusti. Absolutely terrific what you're doing with Brigade. Really inspiring. Can't wait to see where it goes. I know it's got an incredible future ahead of it. And the foundation you've laid is, it feels like it's just ready to turbocharge.
Hope so.
Angie Jerabek, the BARR system, so important for what our kids are doing, and barrcenter.org.
Got it.
Is the website. So folks ought to take a look at that and find out how they can get involved. I'm here with my sister, Debbie Shore, in our Washington studio. I'm Billy Shore. Thank you for listening to Add Passion and Stir. I want to thank our producer, Paul Woody, and District Productive, the best place to go for podcasts, and our team at Share Our Strength and the No Kid Hungry campaign, and our colleague, Kelly Griffin, who helps with this podcast day in and day out. I hope you'll go to our website. I hope you'll go to Apple. I hope you'll find ways to rate us and rank us and subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. I'm Billy Shore. You've been listening to Add Passion and Stir. Add Passion and Stir is distributed by District Productive. Our executive producer is Peter Ogburn. Add Passion and Stir is the creation of Billy Shore, Debbie Shore, and Paul Woody Woodhull.